Hey everyone, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to part 4 of my Logic Pro 10 101 course. In this video, we're going to be using the audio edit tools and edit functions in Logic to build out part of a song arrangement. So in this video, we'll cover most of the edit tools in the arrange area, or the workspace area as it's now called. We're going to skip a few of the tools though and come back to them when they're more relevant. We'll also talk about some of the tool's secondary functions. I'll cover some of the basic snap modes and how to edit directly to the grid, and I'll also show you the fade and marquee click zones for editing. One of the things I love about Logic is how many different ways you can do the same thing. A lot of people ask on YouTube, why do you edit that way as opposed to this way? I like this way better. And it's very simple, it's personal preference. So you'll see some redundant ways to edit in Logic, and that's totally fine. It just means there's sometimes 2 or 3 different ways to do the same thing. So I'm still working with the same project that I started with in part 3. And off screen, what I've done is I've created some new guitar parts. I've recorded some new guitar parts. And I've also added 2 new drummer regions as well with a different pattern. So let me just click on my last drummer pattern here. In order to make the cycle range adopt to that, remember you can press Command U. And let's listen to our new idea here. And essentially this section is going to become essentially the chorus of the song. We just need to edit it up, trim it, and fill it in here as well. One of the things I wanted to show you with the cycle mode is that you can actually use it as a skip cycle mode, meaning that instead of playing just this area, it skips just this area. And so far I haven't filled in this area here, but I wanted to hear what the transition sounds like from the end of the verse here, jumping into the chorus without even editing it and filling this in. So what you can do is when you turn on your cycle mode, remember you can toggle it with C. You can also click on it while holding Command, and it'll turn dark like this. And this is the skip cycle mode. And what it means is when I press play, say over here at measure 30, it's going to skip measure 34 and jump all the way over to 42 so I can hear the transition between this area and this area. And there you go, that's the skip cycle mode. I just hadn't shown you guys that yet, so I figured I'd include that in this video. You can command click on it again to get the regular cycle mode back. Also, for this video, I'm going to be jumping between some different snap modes. And what the snap modes do is they dictate how your edits conform to the grid or maybe don't conform to the grid. So with smart mode, essentially all of your edits will conform to the grid. Let me zoom in here. And let's use the trim function here. So you can see it does snap to grid lines, but you can kind of go in between the grid lines. And if you're looking up here, you'll see that we have 16 grid lines per measure, which means that we have a grid value of a 16th note, or grid division of a 16th note. Now you can change that up here, but you want to go to the custom view so you can actually see what your grid value is. Now if I change this to, say, an 8th note, you'll see that the number of grid divisions that we have halves. With smart mode, it's still going to snap to those, but it's going to, and you can go in between, but it's going to favor those grid values. I don't always like working in smart mode, although it's very useful. Sometimes I may want to use beat mode, where now I'm only snapping to quarter notes, just the beats, the 4 beats per measure, at least in 4/4 time. You can also change this to division. With division, it just snaps to the grid divisions and nothing in between. So you can more or less hone in on just the grid value that you want. If I change this back to a 16th note, you'll see that now we can snap to 16th notes, but again, nothing in between. Now, a little quick trick with any of the snap modes is if you hold Control, it will more or less go down a level, if you know what I mean. Like, for instance, if I go to bar, or let me go to beat mode. On beat mode, if I hold Control, it'll go down to division. So you could really have 2 of them. If I use a division snap and hold Control after I've tried to trim, it'll actually go down to smart mode. So it's just a way to get two different snap values just by holding control. So for now, I'm going to work in beat mode because I want to snap to beats of the measure. There's also a absolute and relative grid value. For all of these examples, I'm going to stick with absolute value, but I'll explain the difference between those in another video. So let's move on to the edit tools now that we understand our four main grid snap modes as well as the grid. So the first tool is obviously the pointer tool, and it's the tool we've been using all along. It's the main tool. But you'll see that there's the second tool next to it. Now, the tool on the left is your primary left click tool. The tool on the right is your command click tool. Right now I have the Marquee Tool selected. So what this means is when I click normally, it's just going to use the pointer tool. But if I hold command, it's going to toggle over to whatever that secondary tool is. And for me, it's the Marquee Tool. Now, you can actually add a third tool up here if you want. To do this, you can go up to Logic Pro 10, Preferences, General, and right here where it says right mouse button, you can click on this and you can say is assignable to a tool. So what this will do is it'll create three tools: a left click tool, a command click tool, and a right click tool. I like using my right click to open up other things like a shortcut menu. So I'm not going to use that. If you like to use it, you can do that. I like my right click tool to pull up these things. Okay, so that's just a little about the left click and the command click tool and then the optional right click tool. Let's talk about some functions of the pointer tool. As we know, the pointer tool can be used to move clips around. Also, you can use it to trim up the left and right side of regions. We said that was just a built-in function in the pointer tool. So you can hover over the left or right side and you can trim audio regions. I also showed you that you can drag over a region and hit Command R to duplicate or repeat. But there's actually another duplicate function built into the pointer tool. If you hold Option while you drag, you'll see this little green plus sign, and you can duplicate clips that way. So that's another way to do that. Another function within the pointer tool is if you press Control and Shift on the back of the grid, not actually on a region, but behind the regions here, you can actually scroll through your timeline this way. So it's just another way to navigate. I prefer just holding Shift, and you can use like a scroll wheel. I have a trackball. I use the scroll wheel on the trackball to navigate around, but that's another way to do it if you don't like using your mouse for that. Now, this isn't a pointer tool function, but I should just bring it up if you're not aware of this. If you just hit Command Z, it undoes the last edit or undoes the last function. So I'm going to go back to what we had before I trimmed up these regions. Now, likewise, you can also hit Command Shift Z, and it redoes it's a redo function. It redoes the last edits or the last functions. All right, so let's move on to the next tool. For all of these other examples, I'm going to exclusively use the command click tool. So remember, with all of these, I'm also holding command while I use them. I almost always have the pointer tool as my primary tool 100% of the time. The next tool down is the pencil tool. It's used for automation. You can draw in automation. It's used for a few other things as well, but until we actually get into automation, it's not really going to be useful to us, so we're going to skip it for now. The eraser tool. The eraser tool allows you to delete regions. So if you click on a region with the eraser tool, it's the same thing as just pressing delete on your keyboard. Again, it's a redundant function that's not really useful in the workspace, although it does have some useful features in the MIDI editor. So we'll talk about that later. The next tool is the text tool. What this allows you to do is it allows you to change the name of an audio region. So if you want to give an audio region a more specific name, like instead of calling this brown tone metal 27.3, maybe I want to call it guitar chorus left. And then maybe I want to call this guitar chorus right. You can do that. So that's just basically what I use it for. So that's just the text tool, pretty simple. The next one up is the scissors tool. Now the scissors tool is highly reliant upon your snap mode, what snap mode you have selected, and also the grid. So right now I have this snap set to beats. So it's only going to cut on the quarter notes within a measure. Even if I try to cut in between quarter notes, it won't cut. It's going to snap the scissors tool to whatever the grid value is based on the snap mode. So if I wanted to make my cuts smaller, I could change the snap mode to division. And now because my division of the grid is 16th notes, I can now cut even smaller increments. Now, I don't really use the scissors tool much because I find myself using another tool called the Marquee Tool that we'll talk about later, or just trimming the region with the built-in trim function. But there is one kind of cool feature with the scissors tool, and it's actually a secondary feature. Let me switch back to bars here. Let's say that we wanted to cut up all of these clips into little 1-bar segments. What you can do is you can cut 1 bar in at the front end of the audio region and hold Option, and you'll see this extra little plus sign. And when you cut, it's now going to cut that whole region into individual 1-bar clips. Now, likewise, let me go down to beat here. If I wanted to create half a bar clips, you could do the same thing. Or 1 beat clips, you could do the same thing. Or even down to the division value. If I want to cut everything up into a bunch of 16th notes, you can. So it's a quick way to cut up samples and loops into smaller pieces. Now, it's not really going to be too useful for me in a rock song like this, but if you're trying to cut up loops and cut up samples and move them around and shuffle them around, do different things with them, it's a very useful feature instead of having to individually click each division or each grid value that you want to cut them into. Likewise, if you have a whole bunch of different regions that you want to join together as a single clip, what you can do is you can drag over all of these and you can select the next tool, which is the glue tool. And what this will do is it'll join those back together. Now, there's also another function where you don't really have to use the glue tool. You can just hit J, and what it'll do is it will create a new audio file out of those clips. It's the join function. It's a little bit different because this is actually creating a new audio file, whereas the glue tool, because these were already cut up and I glued them back together, essentially it's just restoring the original waveform. This is actually creating a new audio file for us. And by the way, if you use the glue tool with, say, 3 different or even two different regions, it will do the same thing as the join function. It will create a new audio file, but it will preserve the original audio file if all of the clips are from the original audio file. The next tool is the solo tool. Now, what the solo tool is it's essentially like a scrub or scrubber tool. What you can do is you can click on a clip, and it'll just play that clip from where you selected. The weird thing, though, is it doesn't really work on audio. See, it just kind of stays there. I don't know if that's a bug. It seems like it's a bug, but it'll work. I've had it work just fine on drummer clips and also MIDI regions, but for some reason it won't work on audio. However, there is a secondary feature to it that does work on audio, and that is when you hold Option when you use it, it'll actually start the playback and solo that individual region from the beginning of the clip. So that's essentially what the solo tool is. It's like a scrub tool or scrubber tool. That's a name that's used in other DAWs out there. And while we're talking about soloing, another feature that's not really part of the solo tool, but I think it's important to mention, is if you click on a track and hit S, it'll actually solo that track. And if you click on a clip and you hit Control S, it'll just solo that clip by itself and mute the others so you can listen to it by itself. And to toggle back, you just press Control S again. So the opposite of soloing is muting, and that is the next tool. That is the mute tool. The mute tool basically just mutes individual audio regions. So this is helpful. I see a lot of people build arrangements where they just have the same thing or similar things just layered up and then looped and looped and looped and looped, and then they go back and then they take out clips, to make some variation along the life of the song. So that's a cool way to mute clips. Although, again, it's kind of redundant because if you just click on a clip and then if you just press Control M, it'll mute that clip without even having to use the mute tool. So again, it's a redundancy. And while we're at it, I should probably mention that if you just hit M by itself, it will mute the entire track that you have selected. The next tool is the zoom tool. Now, I showed you earlier that you could hold Command and press left or right to zoom horizontally, and you could also press Command and up and down to zoom vertically. The zoom tool is just a redundancy for zooming. If you drag over something with the zoom tool, it'll zoom in on that area, and if you click again, it'll zoom back out. I never use the zoom tool because I always use the keyboard shortcuts for zooming. The next tool is the fade tool. What the fade tool does is exactly what it sounds like it does. If you click on the inside of a clip and drag to the outside, it will create a fade. But like I said before, you can use you can do the same thing just by holding Control and Shift with the pointer tool, and it'll create a fade for you. What we didn't talk about is that there are some additional features of fades that are built into the fades, and you don't necessarily have to use the fade tool to do this. If you grab the far left or right side of a fade, depending on which end of a region it's on, you can adjust the length of the fade. If you click on the middle portion, you can adjust the curve of the fade. And if you right-click, you can also remove a fade. Now, if you're in a situation where you want to create a crossfade between two different clips, you can either use the fade tool or you can use the Control-Shift shortcut as well. You can just drag over the joining point of the two waveforms, and it'll create a crossfade for you. Now, with crossfades, you can choose different shapes. If you right-click, you can choose a linear crossfade, you can choose an equal power crossfade, and you can choose an S-curved crossfade. Logic actually defaults to equal power crossfades, and I use those pretty much 99% of the time. But what I will do is I'll grab the middle of these crossfades and move them over to the left sometimes, just to make sure that the more volume-heavy material over here is preserved better. I'm not fading the front end of that waveform too much. Another thing you can do with fades in Logic is you can right-click on a fade and choose to slow down or speed up the fade. So it becomes more or less like a tape or turntable slowdown effect. So you can use it as a special effect. And like I said, likewise, on the front end of a waveform, you can do the same thing, and it becomes a speed up effect. So it's kind of a cool little special effect that's built into the fade tool. All right, and the last tool I want to show you, which is essentially my favorite secondary command click tool, that is the Marquee Tool. I'll be honest, 90% of the time I have the pointer tool in the left click and the Marquee Tool in the command click. And the reason for that is that the Marquee Tool is essentially a selection tool, but you can also use it to trim. So what you can do is you can drag over what you want to get rid of and then just hit delete on your keyboard to trim it up. So another function that you can do with it is you can actually click in the middle of a clip, click on that clip to create a separate region, and then you can move that out of the region. So you can make selections and move things around. So for instance, let's say that this note right here was a bad note and I want to replace it with this note, which is a good note and the same note. What you can do is adjust your snap mode to division so we can really hone in on that one note, click on it, delete it, grab the other correct note, hold Option to duplicate and drag it over. And then what we can do is crossfade the front and end of that to fix that one note. So it's a way to edit takes and fix individual notes, chords, or even wrong drum hits or whatever. So I find the Marquee Tool incredibly helpful and probably the most useful tool of any of the tools other than the pointer tool. Another thing I want to show you that I don't personally use, but I can see how it's a very useful editing feature is click zones. So if you go up to Logic Pro 10, Preferences, General, and make sure you're on the Editing tab again, what you can do from here is you can show Fade Tool and Marquee Tool click zones. We'll talk about the quick swipe and take editing zones later, but for now, let's turn these on, Fade Tool and Marquee Tool click zones. What this does is it separates the track or the waveform into different editing zones. So if I'm in the upper part of a track, it'll become the pointer tool. If I'm in the lower part of a track, it'll become the Marquee Tool automatically without me having to even press Command to select it. So some people would find that even more useful. On the bottom half of the waveform on the far left or right side, you get the trim tool. And notice that because I'm in snap bar, that my trim points are snapping to the bar lines. If you're on the top part, it actually defaults to the fade tool. So you have these 4 different options. You can click with the pointer tool, you can edit with the marquee tool, you can trim, and you can also fade. So it gives you these different editing points to work with, or click zones to work with. To many of you, that may sound like an easier way to edit, and if you like that, then go ahead and use it. I personally don't really like these. I just like using the command click tool to select the marquee tool, and then I just use the control shift function to fade. That's just my own personal preference. All right, so now that I've demonstrated most of the edit tools, let me show you how I would go about editing or building an arrangement out of these different recordings here. First thing I would do is I would change my snap mode to bar, and I would make sure that my snap mode is on absolute value. Then what I'll do is I'll use the marquee tool to delete all this extra stuff in here, and I'll also delete the extra stuff off the end here. So again, just dragging over with the marquee tool, hitting delete. Then I'm going to drag over these 2 new recordings. I'm going to duplicate them into the space here by holding Option. And let's listen to the transition from the back end of the chorus here all the way back to the front end of the intro, because in the arrangement, that's the way it's going to go. It's going to go from chorus, and it's going to repeat all the way back to here. So what I'll do to sort of audition that is drag over all the drummer regions, hit Command U, and then I'm going to actually turn cycle off, play a few bars, and then turn cycle on as the playhead gets to the end of the clip, and it'll jump back to the front end of the song. So I don't really like the way that transition sounds. I feel like I want to do something different with the very last bar of the chorus. What I can do is I can actually borrow something from a different part of the song. So in the middle of the verse, we had this little portion here. So what I'm going to do is with my, again, bar snap and marquee tool, I'm going to drag over both of the guitars. I'm going to hit Command C to copy. And I'm going to go over to the very last bar of my chorus, put the playhead on measure 49, and hit Command V. So we've pasted in that extra clip. Now there's one thing we need to do different though. If I click here, notice that we have an overlapping region. Let me hit Command Z to undo that. That's because right now our drag mode, and we'll talk more about drag modes later, is on X fade, which automatically crossfades clips that overlap. That was too big of an overlap to have a crossfade, so just overlap them. For this, I'm going to use the no overlap drag feature. And what this will do is instead of having that overlap, when I hit Command V to paste, it'll just automatically trim the clip next to it. So it automatically gets rid of the information that we're pasting on top of. But what I want to do is I want to trim this up a little bit. It looks a little sloppy. So I'm going to turn my bar snap off. And by the way, you can toggle that on and off by hitting Command G. You can toggle on and off your snap just by hitting Command G. And if you hover over 2 joining points here, you get this tool that will trim both sides of joined waveforms. So let's try trimming this up to here and try including this little extra note, and let's see what that sounds like. All right, so what I'm going to do now is turn my snap back on, go back to bar snap. With my marquee tool, I'm going to drag over everything, going all the way back to the very first note. I'm going to hold Option and duplicate this whole sequence. So now we're going from the back end of the chorus back to the intro again. Let's see what this sounds like. Much better. So let's say we want to clean up our edits and put little small crossfades in between all of these joining points with all these audio regions. That can be a lot of work if you're sitting there with the fade tool doing every single one individually. What you can do now in Logic 10 is you can drag over all of these, and you can just apply the fade to one of these areas. And what it'll do is it'll create a crossfade on all of them, which is really cool. But I want to show you one other way to do this that I actually like to use more. I just drag over all of the audio regions that I want to create a crossfade on. I go up to the region inspector up here. It says region. Pull that down. And there's an option here for fade ins and fade outs. This allows us to more or less do like batch fade ins, batch fade outs, and also batch crossfades. So what I'll do is I'll go to type here, and instead of a fade out, I'll change this to a crossfade. And you can use linear crossfades or equal power crossfades. I'll double click and you can type in how many milliseconds you want the fade to be. Crossfades like this, I want them to be tiny. So I'm going to type in 5 milliseconds, and then hit enter. And what it'll do is it'll put a 5 millisecond crossfade on each of these joining points, just to make sure there's no pops or clicks in the waveform. We don't need to worry about doing this to the drummer because this is a software instrument. You only have to do this with audio. And one last thing, you can access all of your edit tools more quickly by pressing T on your keyboard. It'll pull up a menu with all of the tools in it, and you can either click on the tool you want or choose one of the individual key commands for each tool. To select the tool for your command click tool, just hold command while you select the tool. All right, so let's listen to this from the back end of the verse through the chorus and then back into the intro again. And there you go. Those are just the basic audio editing tools in Logic. In the next video, we will jump into MIDI, typing in MIDI notes without using a MIDI keyboard, because I realize a lot of people actually prefer to click in their MIDI notes. And what we'll do is, using MIDI, we'll create a software instrument bass for this song, and we may actually layer up some synths or piano or some other instrument to it as well. After we get through with MIDI, we'll start talking about flex time and really like making our audio recordings really sit on the grid well. And then we'll talk about doing more vocal recording. We'll talk more about quick swipe comping, and then finally toward the end of this 10-part series, we'll get into some basic mixing and mastering. So my plan from this point on is to keep working on this song and keep fleshing out this song until we have a final product with drums, guitar, bass, keyboards, and vocals. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more tutorials like this. You can check me out on Twitter, Facebook, and on Patreon. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for the support, and thanks for watching.